Bob Dylan once mocked Ozzy Osbourne, called his music mindless noise. 2 years later, Dylan did something that left Ozzy completely stunned. Bob Dylan stood on stage with an acoustic guitar, singing about war and injustice. His words cut deep. They made people think. They sparked revolutions. Ozzy Osbourne screamed into a microphone, backed by the heaviest riffs the world had ever heard. Black Sabbath shook arenas. They didn't whisper. They roared. 2 different worlds. 2 different philosophies. Folk versus metal. Poetry versus power. Dylan saw himself as an artist, a voice for the voiceless, someone who mattered. And then someone asked him about heavy metal. Dylan didn't hesitate. He called it loud. Empty. Nothing but distortion and screaming. No substance. No soul. Ozzy became the face of everything Dylan hated. The Prince of Darkness. The madman who bit the head off a bat. The guy parents warned their kids about. Dylan's words spread. Magazines quoted him. Fans debated. And Ozzy? He heard every word. But here's the thing. Ozzy didn't fight back. He didn't call Dylan old or irrelevant. He didn't trash talk folk music. He stayed quiet. Because deep down, Ozzy respected Dylan. Always had. Dylan was a legend, a poet, someone who changed music forever. So Ozzy took the hit. And he moved on. 2 years went by. No feud. No drama. Just silence. Until Bob Dylan did something no one expected. He didn't apologize. He didn't take back what he said. But he did something arguably more powerful. He acknowledged Ozzy Osbourne. Publicly. In an interview, Dylan mentioned heavy metal differently. Not with mockery. Not with disdain. With recognition. He called Ozzy a force. Someone who connected with millions. Someone who mattered to his audience the way Dylan mattered to his. Ozzy was floored. He later admitted he never thought Bob Dylan would give him the time of day, let alone respect. It wasn't about who was right. It wasn't about folk versus metal. It was about 2 legends finally seeing each other. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not an apology, not a reversal, just respect. Because at the end of the day, they were both doing the same thing, making people feel something. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand who these 2 men were. Bob Dylan wasn't just a musician. He was a movement. In the early 1960s, America was burning. Civil rights protests filled the streets. The Vietnam War tore families apart. Young people were angry, confused, searching for answers. And Bob Dylan gave them words. Blowing in the wind. The times they are a-changing, songs that didn't just entertain. They challenged. They questioned. They demanded change. Dylan was the voice of a generation. Poets studied his lyrics. Activists quoted him at rallies. He wasn't playing music. He was starting conversations. Folk music was purer, acoustic, honest. Every word mattered. Every note had meaning. That was Dylan's world. Now flip the script. Birmingham, England, for working-class guys who grew up in the shadow of factories and steel mills. Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, and Ozzy Osbourne. They didn't write about peace and protest. They wrote about darkness, fear, the things people didn't want to talk about. War, death, paranoia, mental illness. Black Sabbath wasn't subtle. They were loud, heavy, aggressive. Their music hit you like a freight train. And that was the point. Ozzy didn't have Dylan's way with words. He wasn't a poet. But when he screamed into that microphone, millions of people felt understood. Kids who felt angry, misunderstood, left behind by society. Black Sabbath gave them a place to belong. But here's the problem. The world didn't see it that way. To critics, heavy metal was just noise. Rebellion for rebellion's sake. No artistry. No depth. And Bob Dylan? He agreed. When reporters asked him about the rise of heavy metal, Dylan didn't hide his opinion. He dismissed it, called it loud, mindless, empty, no soul, no message, just distortion and chaos. For Dylan, music was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to elevate people, make them think. Heavy metal, in his eyes, did the opposite. And Ozzy Osbourne became the poster child for everything Dylan criticized. The wild man, the guy who trashed hotel rooms, The guy who became famous for biting the head off a bat on stage. To the outside world, Ozzy was a joke, a spectacle, not an artist. But Ozzy knew the truth. Black Sabbath's fans weren't mindless. They were kids who felt like outsiders, who struggled with depression, anxiety, fear. Sabbath's music gave them an outlet, a voice, just like Dylan's music did for his generation. Two different sounds, two different approaches, but the same mission. Ozzy just didn't know if Bob Dylan would ever see it that way. Bob Dylan sat down for an interview with Rolling Stone magazine. By this point, Dylan had already changed music forever, multiple times. He'd gone electric at Newport, shocked the folk purists, released album after album of groundbreaking work. He was untouchable, a living legend, and the interviewer wanted his take on what was happening in music, because by 1977, the landscape had shifted. Punk was exploding in New York and London. Disco dominated the radio, and heavy metal was growing louder and darker than ever before. Black Sabbath had just released Technical Ecstasy. Led Zeppelin was selling out stadiums. A new generation was headbanging the sound their parents couldn't stand. So the interviewer asked Dylan a simple question. What do you think about heavy metal? Even if that person was Bob Dylan, Ozzy could live with that. So he didn't respond. He just kept making music, kept filling arenas, kept connecting with fans who needed Black Sabbath the way other people needed Bob Dylan. And he moved on, or so he thought. Ozzy Osbourne didn't hold press conferences. He didn't write open letters to Rolling Stone. When Bob Dylan's words hit the newsstands, Ozzy did what he always did. He went back to work. Black Sabbath had a tour to finish, albums to record, fans waiting in arenas across the world. But inside, it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Years later, in his autobiography, Ozzy opened up about that moment. He said reading Dylan's comments felt like getting dismissed by someone he looked up to, because Bob Dylan wasn't just another critic. He was Bob Dylan, the guy who wrote like a Rolling Stone, the guy who changed everything. Ozzy had grown up listening to Dylan's records, studying his lyrics, marveling at how he could say so much with so few words. Dylan was an artist, a real one, and Ozzy always felt like the kid from the wrong side of town who somehow stumbled into fame. He didn't graduate high school, didn't study poetry, couldn't read music. He just screamed into a microphone and hoped it meant something. So when Dylan said heavy metal was empty noise, part of Ozzy wondered if he was right. Maybe Black Sabbath wasn't real music. Maybe it was just loud guitars and dark imagery with nothing underneath. Maybe he was a fraud. But then Ozzy would go on stage, and he'd see the crowds, thousands of kids, fists in the air, singing every word. Kids who told him Black Sabbath saved their lives. That Paranoid got them through depression. That War Pigs gave them a voice when they felt powerless. Those kids weren't listening to noise. They were listening to something that spoke to them, something real. And that's when Ozzy realized something important. Bob Dylan didn't need to understand Black Sabbath, because Black Sabbath wasn't for Bob Dylan. It was for the kids who didn't fit in, the outcasts, the ones who felt too angry, too dark, too different for the world around them. Dylan had his audience, Ozzy had his, and both were valid. So Ozzy made a choice. He wasn't going to fight back, wasn't going to trash Dylan in interviews or try to prove heavy metal was legitimate. He was just going to keep doing what he did best, making music for the people who needed it. In interviews, when reporters brought up Dylan's comments, Ozzy would shrug it off. He'd say something like, "Dylan's a genius. We're just a bunch of loud idiots from Birmingham." Self-deprecating, humble, funny, classic Ozzy. But beneath the jokes, there was something else. Respect. Ozzy never lost his admiration for Bob Dylan. Never spoke badly about him, never held a grudge, because Ozzy understood that artists see the world differently. Dylan saw music as poetry, as a tool for change. Ozzy saw music as catharsis, as a way to scream out the pain and fear that people kept buried inside. Different approaches, different purposes, both necessary. So Ozzy moved on, kept touring, kept recording, kept being Ozzy, and he assumed that was the end of it. Bob Dylan had his opinion. Ozzy had his music. Two parallel paths that would never cross. But Ozzy was wrong, because 2 years later, something unexpected happened. 2 years passed. The world kept spinning. Music kept evolving. And the gap between Bob Dylan and Ozzy Osbourne seemed to grow wider. Dylan released Slow Train Coming, a gospel album, a complete shift in direction. Critics were confused. Fans were divided. But Dylan didn't care. He was on a spiritual journey, exploring faith, questioning everything he thought he knew. That was Dylan, always moving, always changing, never staying in one place long enough for people to pin him down. Meanwhile, Ozzy's world was falling apart. Black Sabbath was crumbling from the inside. Years of touring, substance abuse, and creative differences had taken their toll. The band that once felt invincible was tearing itself apart. And in 1979, they made a decision that shocked the music world. They fired Ozzy Osbourne, the voice of Black Sabbath, the face of heavy metal. Gone. Ozzy was devastated. He'd given everything to that band, bled for it, sacrificed for it, and now he was out. No band, no plan, no idea what came next. He spiraled, drank more, used more, wondered if his career was over. For months, Ozzy disappeared, stayed home, avoided the public, questioned whether he even wanted to make music anymore. Black Sabbath replaced him with Ronnie James Dio, a powerhouse vocalist, someone technically superior to Ozzy in every way. The message was clear. Black Sabbath didn't need Ozzy Osbourne, and maybe the world didn't either. But then something shifted. Sharon Arden, daughter of Sabbath's former manager, saw something in Ozzy that he couldn't see in himself. Potential, talent, a star waiting to break free. She convinced him to go solo, to build something new, something bigger. Ozzy was hesitant, scared, but he trusted her. So he started over, assembled a new band, wrote new songs, recorded a solo album. And in 1980, Blizzard of Oz dropped. It was a monster, Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley. Songs that proved Ozzy wasn't just a guy from Black Sabbath. He was a force on his own. The album went platinum. Ozzy was back, bigger than ever. Meanwhile, Bob Dylan was on his own journey. His gospel phase confused people. Some called it his weakest work. Others called it brave. Dylan didn't care either way. He was exploring, searching for meaning in a world that didn't make sense. Two artists, two completely different paths, and no connection between them. Dylan probably didn't think about Ozzy. Why would he? Ozzy was busy rebuilding his career, proving he still mattered. There was no feud, no ongoing rivalry, no public back and forth. Just two musicians doing their thing in completely separate universes. Fans had moved on. The Dylan comments were old news, ancient history. Nobody expected anything to change. Nobody expected Bob Dylan to ever mention Ozzy Osbourne again. But in 1981, something happened. Dylan sat down for another interview, a casual conversation about music, life, and where things were headed. And somehow, the topic of heavy metal came up again. But this time, Dylan's tone was different. He didn't mock it, didn't dismiss it. He paused, thought about it, and said something that caught everyone off guard. He talked about Ozzy Osbourne, not as a punchline, not as an example of what was wrong with music, but as an artist, someone who connected with millions, someone who mattered to his audience. Dylan acknowledged him, and when Ozzy heard about it, he couldn't believe it. Bob Dylan, the Bob Dylan, had just given him respect. After everything, after the mockery, after the silence, respect. Nobody saw it coming, especially not Ozzy. Bob Dylan sat down with Kurt Loder from Rolling Stone, the same magazine that published his dismissal of heavy metal years earlier. By now, Dylan had been through multiple transformations. Folk icon, rock rebel, gospel preacher. He was impossible to predict, impossible to categorize. And Loder knew how to push buttons. He asked Dylan about the current state of music, about what he thought was happening in rock and roll. Dylan talked about punk, about new wave, about how music was always changing, always reinventing itself. Then Loder brought up heavy metal, and everyone expected Dylan to repeat what he'd said before. Noise, empty, meaningless. But Dylan didn't. Instead, he paused, looked thoughtful, and said something completely different. He said heavy metal had power, that it connected with people in ways other music couldn't. That bands like Black Sabbath and artists like Ozzy Osbourne weren't just making noise. They were speaking to a generation that felt alienated, angry, lost. Dylan said Ozzy understood his audience the same way Dylan understood his. Different sounds, different messages, but the same connection, the same authenticity. Loader was stunned. He pressed Dylan on it. But you said heavy metal was mindless noise. What changed? Dylan smiled, shrugged. He said he'd been wrong to dismiss it so quickly, that he'd listened more, paid attention, seen what it meant to the people who loved it, and he realized something. Music didn't have to be poetry to matter. It didn't have to be acoustic and subtle to be real. Sometimes music was about raw emotion, about volume and aggression, and letting people feel what they couldn't put into words. And that was just as valid. Dylan didn't apologize. That wasn't his style. But he acknowledged Ozzy Osbourne by name, called him a force, someone who understood his craft, someone who gave his fans exactly what they needed. The interview hit the stands, and the music world exploded. Bob Dylan, the Bob Dylan, had just praised Ozzy Osbourne. Critics couldn't believe it. Fans debated it endlessly. Some said Dylan was just being diplomatic. Others said he genuinely changed his mind. But the people who were most shocked? Ozzy's camp. Sharon Arden read the interview first. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She showed it to Ozzy, and Ozzy read it 3 times, just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Bob Dylan had acknowledged him, not as a joke, not as a cautionary tale, as a legitimate artist. Ozzy didn't know what to say. For years, he'd carried Dylan's word with him, that sting of being dismissed by someone he admired. He'd made peace with it, moved on, built his solo career. But deep down, part of him still wondered if Dylan was right. If Black Sabbath was just noise. If he was just a performer, not an artist. And now, Dylan himself was saying otherwise. Ozzy later admitted in interviews that he never expected it. He said Dylan didn't owe him anything, didn't need to acknowledge him, but he did. And it meant more to Ozzy than most people realized, because it wasn't about validation. Ozzy didn't need Bob Dylan's approval to know his music mattered. His fans had already told him that, every night, in every arena. But hearing it from Dylan felt different. It felt like being seen, like someone he respected finally understood what he was trying to do. Not folk music, not poetry, just honest, raw, heavy music for people who needed it. And Dylan got it. After all those years, after the mockery, after the silence, he got it. Ozzy didn't respond publicly, didn't make a big deal out of it. But privately, he was floored. Because sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do isn't apologize. It's recognize you. And Bob Dylan had just done exactly that. Ozzy Osbourne didn't hold a press conference. He didn't call Rolling Stone and demand a follow-up interview. He didn't post about it. Didn't make a statement, didn't turn it into a headline. That wasn't Ozzy's style. But people close to him noticed something. Sharon saw it first. Ozzy was different after reading that interview. Lighter, like a weight had been lifted. He kept the magazine, folded it, put it somewhere safe. And when friends came over, he'd casually mention it. Dylan said something nice about me. Can you believe that? He'd laugh, shake his head, like he still couldn't wrap his mind around it. Because for Ozzy, Bob Dylan wasn't just another musician. Dylan was untouchable, a genius, someone who operated on a completely different level. And for years, Ozzy had assumed Dylan saw him as a joke. The wild man, the guy who bit a bat, the spectacle, not an artist. So when Dylan acknowledged him, it hit differently. It wasn't about needing approval. Ozzy's career was exploding. Blizzard of Oz had gone platinum. Diary of a Madman was climbing the charts. Ozzy was selling out arenas, building a legacy outside of Black Sabbath. He didn't need Bob Dylan to validate him, but it still mattered, because Dylan represented something Ozzy always wanted but never thought he'd get. Respect from the old guard, from the people who shaped music before heavy metal even existed. Ozzy had spent his entire career being dismissed, Critics called Black Sabbath talentless, called their music devil worship, called Ozzy a clown. Parents hated him. Churches protested him. Mainstream media mocked him. And Ozzy played into it, leaned into the chaos, the madness, the Prince of Darkness persona. Because if people were going to call him crazy anyway, he might as well own it. But underneath all the theatrics, Ozzy cared. He cared about his music, about his fans, about whether what he was doing actually meant something. And hearing Bob Dylan say it did, that it connected with people the same way Dylan's music connected with his audience, that changed something for Ozzy. In later interviews, Ozzy talked about that moment. He said he never expected Dylan to come around, never thought Dylan would see past the makeup and the madness. But Dylan did, and it reminded Ozzy of something important, that artists don't have to agree, don't have to like the same music, don't have to understand each other's methods, but they can still respect the work. Dylan saw what Ozzy was doing, saw that it wasn't just noise. It was connection. It was catharsis. It was giving people a space to feel things they couldn't express anywhere else. And that was enough. Ozzy also said something else in those interviews. He said Dylan's acknowledgement made him more confident, not in a cocky way, but in a way that allowed him to stop questioning himself, to stop wondering if Black Sabbath was a fluke, if his solo career would last, if he was just a novelty act. Dylan's words gave him permission to believe in what he was doing, to trust that heavy metal wasn't lesser, just different. And that difference was the whole point. So Ozzy kept going, kept making music, kept pushing boundaries, kept being himself. But now, when critics dismiss him, it didn't sting the same way, because one of the greatest songwriters of all time had looked at Ozzy's work and said it mattered. That was enough. Years later, Ozzy crossed paths with Bob Dylan in an award show. They didn't have a deep conversation, didn't sit down and hash out the past. They just nodded at each other, a brief acknowledgement. Two legends, two completely different worlds, but mutual respect. Ozzy later said he didn't need anything more than that. No apology, no long explanation, just that nod. Because sometimes respect doesn't need words. It just needs recognition. And Bob Dylan had given Ozzy exactly that. Not because he had to, not because anyone asked him to, but because he finally understood what Ozzy had been doing all along, making music that mattered to the people who needed it most. And in the end, that's all any artist can hope for, to be seen, to be understood, even if it takes years, even if it comes from the most unexpected place. This story isn't really about Bob Dylan and Ozzy Osbourne. It's about something bigger. It's about how we see art, how we judge it, how we decide what matters and what doesn't. Bob Dylan represented one philosophy of music. Music as poetry, as protest, as a vehicle for change. Every word mattered. Every note had to mean something. Dylan believed music should make you think, should challenge you, should push you towards something better. And he was right. His music did all those things. It inspired movements, changed minds, gave people the language to fight for what they believed in. Dylan's approach to music was valid, necessary, powerful, but it wasn't the only way. Ozzy Osbourne represented a completely different philosophy. Music as release, as catharsis, as a way to scream out the things you can't say. Not every song needed a message. Not every lyric needed to be profound. Sometimes music was just about feeling, about letting the anger and fear and pain pour out of you. And that was valid too, because the kids who loved Black Sabbath weren't looking for poetry. They were looking for someone who understood what it felt like to be angry, scared, misunderstood. They were looking for music that matched the chaos inside them, and Ozzy gave them that. For years, these two philosophies clashed. Folk fans looked down on metal fans, called them mindless, unsophisticated. Metal fans looked at folk music and called it soft, boring, out of touch. Two tribes, two completely different ideas of what music should be. And neither side wanted to admit the other had value. But here's the truth. Both mattered. Dylan's music helped people find their voice, helped them articulate their beliefs, gave them the courage to fight for change. Ozzy's music helped people survive, helped them feel less alone, gave them an outlet when the world felt too heavy. Different purposes, different audiences, but the same core mission: to connect with people, to make them feel something, to give them what they needed. And that's what Bob Dylan finally understood. He didn't have to like heavy metal, didn't have to enjoy Ozzy's music, but he could respect what it did for the people who loved it, because at the end of the day, Ozzy was doing the same thing Dylan was, giving his audience a voice, a sense of belonging, a reason to keep going, just in a different key. This is the lesson most people miss. We spend so much time arguing about what's real music, what's good art, what counts. We create hierarchies, gatekeep, dismiss things we don't understand. But the truth is, art doesn't have to be one thing. It can be a poem. It can be a scream. It can be a whisper or a roar. What matters is the connection. Does it speak to someone? Does it make them feel seen? Does it give them what they need in that moment? If the answer is yes, then it's valid. Dylan's folk anthems were valid. Ozzy's heavy metal was valid. Both changed lives. Both shaped generations. And the moment Dylan acknowledged that, something shifted. It wasn't just about two musicians respecting each other. It was about tearing down the walls between genres, between philosophies. It was about recognizing that music is big enough for all of it, the quiet and the loud, the poetic and the primal, the thinkers and the feelers. There's room for everyone. And that's what makes this story so powerful, because it shows that even legends can grow, can change their minds, can admit they didn't see the full picture. Dylan didn't have to acknowledge Ozzy. He could have stuck to his original opinion, dismissed heavy metal forever. But he didn't. He listened. He paid attention. He saw what it meant to people. And he gave Ozzy the respect he deserved. Not because Ozzy needed it, but because it was the right thing to do. And Ozzy, he didn't gloat, didn't rub it in anyone's face. He just appreciated it. Quietly, humbly, because that's what real artists do. They respect the craft, even when it looks different from their own. So the next time you're tempted to dismiss something you don't understand, remember this story. Remember that Bob Dylan once thought heavy metal was meaningless noise, until he realized it wasn't. It was just different. And different doesn't mean lesser. It just means there's more to the story than you thought. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen, really listen, because you might be surprised by what you find. So what do we take away from all of this? What's the lesson hiding inside this story about two rock legends who barely knew each other? It's simple, but it's something most people struggle with their entire lives. The loudest response isn't always a response at all. When Bob Dylan dismissed Ozzy Osbourne, the world expected a fight, expected Ozzy to fire back, to defend heavy metal, to trash folk music in return. That's what we do now, isn't it? Someone criticizes us. We hit back harder. We defend ourselves. We prove them wrong. We turn everything into a battle. But Ozzy didn't do that. He stayed silent. Not because he was weak. Not because he agreed with Dylan. But because he understood something most people don't. Not every criticism deserves a response. Sometimes the best thing you can do is keep moving forward. Keep doing your work. Keep serving your audience. Keep being yourself. Let the work speak for itself. And that's exactly what Ozzy did. He didn't waste energy fighting Bob Dylan. Didn't spend years trying to prove heavy metal was legitimate. He just kept making music, kept connecting with fans, kept building something that mattered. And eventually, the truth revealed itself. Heavy metal wasn't noise. It was powerful. It was necessary. And Dylan saw that, on his own, in his own time. Because the truth doesn't need you to defend it. It just needs time to be seen. That's lesson number 1. Here's lesson number 2. Respect doesn't always arrive when you expect it. Ozzy didn't get Dylan's acknowledgement in 1977, or 1978, or 1979. He got in 1981, years later, after he'd already moved on, after he'd already rebuilt his career. And that's how it works sometimes. The people who doubt you won't always come around immediately. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it never happens at all. But when it does happen, it's almost always when you stop waiting for it, when you stop needing it. because by then, you've already proven yourself to yourself. And that's what matters most. Lesson number 3. Growth is possible, even for legends. Bob Dylan didn't have to change his mind about heavy metal. He was Bob Dylan, one of the most influential artists of all time. He could have dismissed Ozzy forever, and no one would have questioned it. But he didn't. He listened. He paid attention. He reconsidered. And that takes humility. It takes strength to admit you were wrong, or at least that you didn't see the whole picture. Dylan could have stayed stuck in his original opinion, could have doubled down, but instead he grew. And that's what separates good people from great ones. Great people stay curious, stay open, keep learning, even when they're already at the top. Finally, lesson number 4. Different doesn't mean wrong. Dylan and Ozzy made completely different music. Folk versus metal. Acoustic versus electric. Poetry versus power. And for years, people acted like only one could be right. Like there was a hierarchy, a correct way to make music. But there isn't. Music is vast. Art is vast. Life is vast. There's room for the quiet and the loud, the subtle and the aggressive, the thinkers and the feelers. There's room for Bob Dylan and Ozzy Osbourne. And the sooner we understand that, the better off we'll be. Because the world doesn't need everyone to be the same. It needs people to be themselves, fully, authentically, even if that looks different from everyone else, especially if it looks different. So here's what the story teaches us. Don't waste energy fighting people who don't understand you. Do your work. Trust your vision. Serve the people who need what you have to offer. The rest will figure itself out. And when respect finally comes, whether it's from a legend or a stranger, accept it gracefully, because it's not about being right. It's about being real. Bob Dylan and Ozzy Osbourne taught us that. 2 legends, 2 completely different paths, but the same commitment to authenticity. And in the end, that's what connected them. Not music, not genre, not style, just honesty. And that's something we can all learn from. So that's the story. Bob Dylan mocked Ozzy Osbourne, called his music meaningless noise. Ozzy stayed silent, didn't fight back, just kept doing his thing. And 2 years later, Dylan did something no one expected. He acknowledged Ozzy, gave him respect, recognized what he was doing, not because he had to, but because he finally understood. 2 legends, 2 completely different worlds, but mutual respect. And that's what makes this story worth telling. Because it's not just about Bob Dylan and Ozzy Osbourne. It's about all of us. It's about how we handle criticism, how we respond to people who don't understand us. It's about staying true to ourselves even when the world dismisses us. And it's about recognizing that respect doesn't always come when we want it. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it never comes at all. But when it does, it's worth the wait. Now here's my question for you. Do you think Bob Dylan ever truly misunderstood heavy metal? Or was he just being honest about his own taste at the time? Because there's a difference between not liking something and not respecting it. Dylan didn't like heavy metal in 1977. That's fair. But by 1981, he respected what it did for people. And maybe that's the real growth. Not changing what you like, but understanding why others love what they love. So let me know in the comments. Do you think Dylan genuinely changed his mind? Or was he just being diplomatic? And have you ever had a Bob Dylan moment in your own life? Someone who dismissed what you were doing, only to come around years later? Or maybe you were the Bob Dylan. Maybe you dismissed something you didn't understand, then realized later it had value. Either way, drop your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if you enjoyed this story, here's what I need from you. Hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I'm digging up more legendary moments like this. Stories about the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, all the icons you thought you knew, but told in ways you've never heard before. And turn on notifications, because YouTube doesn't always show you new videos unless you tell it to I'm dropping a new story every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss them. Next week, I'm covering the time Keith Richards insulted Metallica, and what James Hetfield did in response will blow your mind. It's another story about respect, about legends clashing, about growth, and it's just as powerful as this one. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure notifications are on, because these stories matter. They remind us that even the greatest artists are human. They make mistakes. They grow. They change. And if they can do it, so can we. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. And remember, the loudest response isn't always a response at all. Sometimes silence is stronger. Sometimes patience is the answer. And sometimes respect arrives exactly when you stop waiting for it. So keep doing your thing. Keep being yourself. The world will catch up eventually. And when it does, you'll be ready. See you next week.